Hey, what's going on? I'm just gonna jump right into the video here. So, Marvel and DC Comics have been in a weird place for the past 30 plus years, and in my opinion, are suffering from what I like to call the post-crisis problem, which is in reference to DC Comics in particular, because this is a problem that DC has in the heart of its publishing initiative, and has, once again, for the better part of 30 years. But there are definitely a lot of Marvel characters that suffer this problem as well. It used to be, with comics, that you would have characters, and writers and artists would use those characters to explore concepts and tropes in science fiction, or fantasy, or politics, or crime drama, or even just drama with slice-of-life comics, and tell stories. And most of the time, these stories would change the way a character saw the world, or change the way a character saw themselves, or sometimes they would even change the way we saw those characters. But now, it feels like comics are less interested in using characters to explore themes and ideas that relate to the real world, and instead are more interested in dissecting the mythology of these characters themselves, or in a lot of cases, fixing the mythology if thought to be necessary. And again, I think this is a major problem, for a multitude of reasons, mind you, but I'll try to limit them to just two. The first is a bit of a macro scale problem, and it's the nature of continuity. But this isn't one of those typical arguments of, yeah, now there's too many comics, and there's too much history, and everything's just, it's so confusing. In fact, it's quite the opposite. I think writers and artists and editors focusing too much on continuity is the problem. The very nature of reboots and retcons is to fix continuity, and to fix characters, to make the history seem less confusing for people. But while the intent is noble and good, the problem, however, lies in the execution. But this isn't a matter of concept versus execution in the sense that, the very idea is solid, it just needs the proper guidance to see it through. It's just an inherently flawed concept. Because who's to say that after the continuity of a character or a universe is rewritten in an attempt to make things less confusing, 5 to 10 years later, somebody else comes along and is like, hey, I liked that thing the way it was, so I'm gonna change it back. And in another 5 to 10 years, somebody else comes along and is like, hey, these things are confusing. What if we streamline them together and we make a new thing? But that only makes everything all the more confusing. And there's no better example of this than DC's continuity, if you can even call it that anymore. And they've had this problem since 1986 after Crisis on Infinite Earths, a giant line-wide event that collapsed DC's multiverse and made a new Earth, with one singular continuity, because everyone working there felt like the multiverse idea was just too confusing for the fans as it was for the creators. And at the time, it was a successful venture, because it brought in a lot of new DC readers, and it built a new generation of DC fans, at the risk of losing some of the old ones who liked the continuity and the characters as they were. In this new DC universe, all the popular characters have been around for 10 plus years, while the other characters, like Wonder Woman and Captain Marvel, Shazam, had major adjustments to their history to fit the new universe. The Justice League was established, but instead of them being home to characters anyone really associates with the core Justice League, it's just a bunch of C and D-list heroes, plus Batman. And for the time, it was successful. But then some years go by, and new creators and new editors come on board to be the custodians of these characters and this universe. And then there was a new event called Zero Hour. And Zero Hour was designed to reincorporate certain elements from DC Silver and Golden Age, as to bring back some of the older readers that they lost after Crisis. Which, from what I'm told, because I wasn't alive yet, worked. at the cost of confusing a lot of the newer readers that DC garnered with Crisis. And over the years, writers and editors, they just begin implementing more and more elements from DC's Gold and Silver Age anyways. So now, older readers are confused because elements from the original continuity and the new continuity are at fundamental odds with one another, and the multiverse that DC worked so hard to collapse into one continuity starts to come back, and the new readers start to show up to the party, and they're like, what the fuck is even happening? What is this place? And then DC does this other event called Infinite Crisis, and it's a sequel to Crisis on Infinite Earths, and in that, the multiverse is collapsed again. But then 3 years later, DC publishes Final Crisis, which brings back the multiverse, and then the very next year, they rewrite the multiverse with the New 52, and then 5 years later, they publish Rebirth, which rewrites the rewritten universe to be more like it was before it got rewritten in the first place. And then they have a new event called Death Metal, which rewrites the rewritten universe to be rewritten again, so that everything over the past 30 years, no matter how contradictory or confusing, happened anyways. You see how this is a problem, right? At one point in time, the DC Universe was a place where writers and artists could utilize characters to explore and deconstruct concepts and tropes in different genres. Now, it just feels like they're spinning their wheels in an attempt to justify their existence to a dwindling audience and corporate sugar daddies. But make no mistake, Marvel has this problem too, albeit on a smaller scale, more often pertaining to characters individually. Take Spider-Man, for example. Since 1994, the Spider-Man office over at Marvel has been in a constant death loop of fixing Spidey after the previous creative and editorial team broke the character. And it all started with Clone Saga, because for some godforsaken reason, the powers that be took a look at Spider-Man and were like, yo, what the fuck? Spider-Man's not relatable anymore. Now he's married to some bitch, and he's worried about financial problems. Remember when Peter Parker was a teaching assistant at ESU, and he was fucking Black Cat on top of the World Trade Center? Or remember when he had to run out on dates, or he was late to them with any of the 8 million women from his harem because he had to go fight bad guys as Spider-Man? Remember those good old days? That's when Spider-Man was relatable. So in an effort to fix the problem, they resurrected the clone of Peter Parker from a story in like the 70s where Peter's college professor hated Peter because he was in love with Gwen Stacy, who was dating Peter at the time. So we cloned both Gwen and Peter so that he could hate fuck Gwen while cucking Peter, but they were both clones so it wasn't real. And I don't know why I offered that detailed an explanation of the original Clone Saga, but yeah, I mean, it's great. You should definitely check it out, by the way. Anyways, that story ends with Peter's clone dying. But then not really, because Marvel retcons that he never died in the first place, and that he went off to live a life of his own under a new identity as Ben Reilly, and they were going to use Ben to replace Peter as Spider-Man, because Ben, he wasn't burdened with marriage or financial responsibility, so he was going to be the new Spider-Man, and he was going to go on his own adventures. But then Norman Osborn came back to life, and then Judas from the Bible became a Spider-Man villain, and then it all just got really, really fucking stupid. So everybody just gave up on this whole Spider-Man initiative, and then Ben died, and Peter was made Spider-Man again. But by that point, like 60% of the Spider-Man readership had pieced the fuck out. And then Marvel approaches John Romita Jr. and J. Michael Straczynski with a pitch that I can only imagine went like, hey, we kind of broke the character of Spider-Man. Can you, fix him for us? And they were like, yeah, sure, I guess. Spider-Man's cool. So, J. Michael Straczynski, or, just JMS, and John Romita Jr., and later Ron Garney, who's the secondary artist for this whole run, they have this whole series on Spider-Man, where it's intentionally designed to put the pieces back together that were shattered after the Clone Saga, as well as some of the other bizarre character choices that were made in the late 90s, while also making a lot of divisive creative choices with the character, like making him an avatar to the Spider God, giving Peter organic web shooters, revealing his identity to Aunt May, and making Spider-Man a card-carrying member of the Avengers, and ultimately living in Avengers Tower. And then somebody at Marvel was like, yo, what the fuck? Spider-Man's not relatable anymore. So then Civil War happens, Peter becomes a fugitive, and then Aunt May becomes the lyric to a rap song, and the Spider-Man book gets rebooted with this storyline called One More Day, where Peter makes a deal with the devil to rewrite his personal continuity, and then Marvel approaches a whole new series of writers to do this rotating creative team bit, and they approach them with this pitch that I can only imagine went something like, hey, we kind of broke the character of Spider-Man. Can you fix him for us? And they were like, yeah, sure, I like Spider-Man. And after the rotating circuit had come to a close, and Dan Slott was chosen to be the sole writer of the character, his run was initially designed to put the pieces back together by giving Spidey a more familiar status quo, which pretty much just paved over all the changes that JMS made to the character, while also making a lot of divisive creative choices with the character, like making him a quirky Big Bang Theory character, making him a billionaire, making Spider-Man the center of Marvel's multiverse, and making a sequel to the Clone Saga. And after a pretty, again, divisive 10-year-long run on the character, Marvel approaches Nick Spencer and Ryan Ottley with a pitch that I can only imagine went something like, hey, we kind of broke the character of Spider-Man. Can you fix him for us? And then Nick Spencer and Ryan Ottley have this whole run that's essentially a 75-plus issue middle finger to Dan Slott in the second half of JMS's runs respectively, and you see how this is a problem, right? And my biggest fear with Spider-Man as a character, at least as far as the comics are concerned, is this just what Spider-Man comics are going to be forevermore? Creative teams taking the character in uncharted, divisive territory, and then the next creative team coming on board, apologizing for what they did, while also taking the character in uncharted, divisive territory, rinse, wash, repeat. And that's the other thing with this constant need to fix what's broken with these characters and these universes. Repetition becomes a major problem, because after each major change to continuity or the status quo, there's a demand to put things back, or make things more familiar. And again, these worlds and these characters just get trapped in an endless loop of the status quo. And worse yet is when you have big brain writers try to comment on the status quo while also doing nothing to actively disrupt it. And again, I'd argue that you're not telling stories at that point, but much rather justifying the existence of said characters or universes to still be hanging around. Anyways, what are your thoughts on all this? I'd love to hear what somebody else has to say. Let me know down below in the comment section. Also, if you like this video, hit the like button, share, support the channel, and if you want to see more content like this, all you have to do is subscribe. I'm the Mystical Green Beanie. Thank you for watching, and as always, until next time, adios nachos, adios.